Today on Personally Speaking, my guest is Peter Stanford. He's a great English writer who happens to be a person very devoted to his Catholic faith, of Irish background, and he talks a lot about the state of the church today. A wonderful, delightful guest. Please join us for our interview on Personally Speaking with Peter Stanford. Hello and welcome to Personally Speaking. I'm your host, Msgr Jim Lisante, and Peter Stanford joins me now. Peter is an award-winning British writer, journalist, broadcaster, and prison reform campaigner. His books include biographies of the Labour cabinet minister and penal reformer Lord Langford and Cardinal Basil Hume. He has written on the history, theology, and cultural significance of religious ideas, and his books have been translated into 12 languages. Peter is currently working on a biography of the architect Antoni Gaudi to be published in 2026 to mark the 100th anniversary of his death. Peter is a former editor of the Catholic Herald. He writes features for the Daily and Sunday Telegraph titles, and he has an interview column in The Tablet. He was one of the BBC commentary team for the papal visit to Britain in 2010. I'm happy to say that Peter Stanford also has been director of the Longford Trust for Penal Reform since 2002. He lives in London with his wife. He is the father, along with his wife, of two adult children, and he's delightfully here with us today to talk about his life, his career, his faith, and the values that mean the most to him. Joining me now, I'm so pleased to welcome to Personally Speaking the great writer, Peter Stanford. I'd like to welcome Peter Stanford onto our program, Personally Speaking. He's talking to us from England. I mentioned in my introduction, he has written so many great books that we'll talk about in a little bit. But Peter, first of all, thanks for coming on the program. And my first question for you would be, when someone spends as much time as you have writing about the church and the things of faith, I'm always intrigued by a family of origin. So Mary, Catherine, and Reginald, your parents, what kind of folks were they, and what kind of home did they create in terms of a spiritual perspective?
Gosh, well, it's very nice to be here. So thank you for inviting me. And I was going to say it's always nice to talk about your parents. It isn't always true, but I was very, very lucky with my parents. So my mum was from Liverpool. So Liverpool, when she grew up there in the 30s and 40s, was a very sectarian town. So Catholics and Protestants at each other's necks, and probably more in that sense, but it was a very so we were very Catholic, which obviously at times when you're a teenager isn't entirely what you want, but I'm really glad that I was, and so my mum was one of 10, and so I had lots of aunts and uncles and cousins. I think I had 23 first cousins in Liverpool. And we all got together all the time. I remember my mother always used to say when I was at school, and I'd say, "Oh, I haven't got many friends at the moment." She said, "What do you need friends for? You've got your cousins." And they had a very, very, I was going to say like lots of sort of Italian Catholics or Spanish Catholics or Irish Catholics. They were originally Irish, obviously. And perhaps it's true of other denominations. I'm in no place to know. But a very, very strong foundation. So my dad wasn't Catholic. My mum and dad met during the Second World War, when my mum had gone to work. I think it was the Ministry of Supply or something in London. So she'd grown up in Liverpool. She'd been good at reading and typing and all of those things. And, now would have happily gone on to university. She was very bright. But those things weren't possible then. They had very little money. So she worked down there, and she met my dad in London, and they decided to get married. And so by that stage, she got rather grand ideas of being in London. So she went to the Jesuit church. Anyone who knows London will know this. Very beautiful Jesuit church in Mayfair Farm Street. And the Jesuits then were very liberal and relaxing. Oh yeah, Catholic, non-Catholic, doesn't matter. We can marry everyone. Good. In 1946, they got married, 1946. But then her sort of half Irish Irish mother said, "You're not getting married in London. Come on, I'll do the accent if you want. You're not getting married in London." So back she went to Liverpool, and the priest said, "No, your husband has to become a Catholic."
Oh
And
boy.
my mother was quite fierce, so she said, "He doesn't have to become a Catholic." And
Mm.
my dad always said, "Well, I'd be one if she wanted me to." And so they ended up by getting married in a side chapel in the afternoon with the lights turned off, which so not a good moment. Partly explained, in fairness, by that sectarian thing that was going on in Liverpool then.
Mhm.
Very, not, and it's great now, absolutely great. Don't let it put anyone off. Liverpool Catholic Cathedral is the most beautiful modern building you'll ever see. Have you seen it?
Yes, I
It's
have.
it's like a rocket with this
Right.
amazing bell tower of stained glass. It's beautiful at all times of the year. And my poor old dad, my mum died in 1998, and my dad was around for 6 years afterwards. And he kept going to mass every Sunday
Wow.
and sort of always said he thought of himself as a Catholic. And then he was taken ill quite suddenly. And I was on my way up, and the priest went to see him. And the priest said, "Mr. Stanford, you've been coming to mass now for about 60 years. If you want to become a Catholic, I can just do it now." And he said, "I need time to think about it," was really what my dad said. He didn't have a lot of time. And so when I
No.
got there, I said, "Well, why not just do it now if that's what you want to do?" He said, "I'm not sure your mother would like it." She said, "I shouldn't be. They shouldn't make me do anything." So he didn't become a Catholic at that stage, but our very nice parish priest up there allowed him to have a
Sounds like he
Catholic
was.
funeral.
And let me ask, was he Church of England before that? Or I guess for
Sort
that.
of. Not very much really. I don't know I don't remember ever talking to him about it, to be honest. Isn't that awful?
Well, Peter, how did they, though, communicate spiritual or faith-filled values to you and to your siblings?
My mother and her great clan of sisters did it. In my mother's family, I'm trying to think if any of them are alive to hear. No, none of them are alive anymore. They were actually one of them is still just. He won't be listening to this. So, they were all a bit pathetic. The men, the women were really strong, and the men. My grandfather had been rather less than staunch, and my grandmother was a really fierce. I remember my grandmother just about sitting in the corner of the room all the time in a rocking chair. So the men were always a bit weak. So what happened was we all went to Catholic schools.
Hmm.
I've got a much older brother and a much older sister, and if you want me to, I can explain why there's a gap. And then so we all went to Catholic schools. I went to an Irish Christian Brother school. There were lots of Irish Christian Brother schools around Liverpool. And when they came over to Liverpool, probably in the middle of the 19th century, Edmund Ignatius Rice, who I think is now a saint from Waterford, his mission. I mean, they obviously had an official mission. I can't even remember what that is. But what their unofficial everyday motto was, they wanted to take the children of dockers and turn them into doctors. And so they ran all these grammar schools
Wow.
around London. And here I am. So, I mean, I didn't always love the Christian Brothers were an odd bunch. I didn't always love my Catholic education, but
But it benefited you in time. Oops, sorry.
yeah,
Peter,
indeed, I'm very
Peter, you
grateful.
know that the way I found you is because I had, as I mentioned to you before the show, I had interviewed and had on as a guest speaker here in America, Cardinal Basil Hume. And so when your 1990s book came out about him, I was quick to grab it and read it and things. And
Oh,
I mentioned that to you because the thing about Basil Hume, and we did several interviews on a program like this over the years. He always seemed as a open-minded man who we might identify now as progressive back in the 70s and 80s to walk on, as we say, proverbial eggshells in terms of telling the church what it needed to hear in terms of being orthodox, but at the same time having an open mind. So, for instance, when then Cardinal Ratzinger came out with the statement from his congregation saying, that folks who were homosexual were disordered, fundamentally disordered, he didn't disagree with that, but he said that no teaching has power unless it reflects the compassion of Jesus. And I asked him in that specific teaching, and he said it lacks the face of the compassionate Christ. So he's not saying he disagrees with the teaching, just that it's taught badly. I mention that because now here we are in the age of Pope Francis, and those things that Cardinal Hume said so carefully and gently many years ago are said quite boldly from Pope Francis. I guess what I'm saying is lots of Catholic folks feel kind of whipped. They've lived through Benedict and John Paul, and they've lived through what was perceived to be conservative Catholicism. Now they think of Francis as progressive Catholicism. As a man who tries to report on what the church is about historically and contemporarily, that's not even a word, but you know what I'm saying. Um, how are we to make sense of the fact that depending on the personality and background of the Pope, the church seems to change, even though we know it's unchangeable? It does change in terms of the personality of the individual pontiff. How are we to make sense of that?
It's tough making sense of it, isn't it? Because to a certain extent, we all make sense of it in whichever way we want the church to change. So we tend to approve of things. So I think there's lots about Pope Francis, which is wonderful. But I also had a sneaking regard for Pope Benedict. People often describe Pope Benedict as simply carrying on from what John Paul II did, and he didn't in a way. The thing I loved about Pope Benedict, he kept saying sorry for things. I mean, admittedly, they were things that had happened quite a long time ago, but I was always brought up to say that saying sorry is a strength, not a weakness.
Mm.
And I think it's one of the ways of reaching out to people rather than like sticking on your spot moving forward. And I was editor of a Catholic newspaper here for when John Paul II was Pope, and well, it certainly filled the paper every week. He was always doing something, and he was always saying something, and so that was fascinating. I some people belong to a particular moment, and some people transcend moments, and I think Basil Hume is one of those people who transcended moments. So in terms of his moment in my country, what he did was our Catholic leaders in Britain since the restoration of the hierarchy after the Reformation. So they restored the hierarchy in 1850, and they'd always kept themselves out of general politics. They were always we were a group apart. We always saw ourselves as separate. I grew up in a parish where if you went to the doctor, if you went to the dentist, if you did anything, you went to another Catholic from the parish. You
Right.
didn't mix with people who had done it. So it was quite insular. Hume's phrase was a fortress church, is what he called it. And what he did was he just gently brought all those things down. So, he'd appear at royal events when the Queen wanted a Catholic there. He would go and meet political leaders who all, I mean, he was you've met him. He was wonderful. People
Yes.
liked him. They felt they could talk to him. And I think the thing that he did, well, two things I remember. I mean, he was always incredibly nice to me, which in a selfish sort of way is why you like people. But he did two things. He carried God in his shadow, I think, when he went around. I think. I'm not meaning this judgmentally about anybody else, but what I like what I respond to in a leader of my church is someone who may be good at administration, or probably better, they're good at administration and things, but someone who had a sense of God. And it was a sense of God that you didn't have to be Catholic to see. Everyone got it.
Peter Stanford's our guest. I mentioned the great English author now. Peter, let's get more personal for a moment here. Move from that great church of ours to the personal. Like most priests, have the privilege of witnessing weddings every weekend, and so that I might give a homily that's not just a canned thing about love and marriage. I like to have them write me an essay on why is this the one. So you are a happily married man, and you have a beautiful wife, Siobhan, and I want to know if you had to write that essay for me now, why did you select her? Maybe more interesting, why did she select you? But why was she
Um,
the one that you said, I can build a life with this woman?
yes. Well, what happened was we were introduced by two friends. So my wife is a lawyer, and she had a
Wait, wait,
barrister
wait. You didn't meet online?
We didn't meet. No, there wasn't any online. Hey,
It's
look
the
how
way of the
old I
world
am.
today. Yes. Yeah.
We were introduced by these two friends. So Siobhan's friend Sue was Jewish, and one of my oldest friends from university, Ben, was Jewish, and they met each other. Now they were put together by a Jewish matchmaker, and so when I met Sue, I said, "Gosh, Ben's one of the." I must have been about 30 then. I said, "Oh, Ben's one of my few kind of male friends who's single still." She said, "Oh, do you want to meet someone?" And I said, well, yes. I've done my best and it's always gone a bit wrong. And she said, I've got someone I can introduce you to. And I said, who? She said, you'll get on, you're Catholic. And I said, no, 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 no. You're misunderstanding. I understand that in Judaism and marrying in them, I understand that. We don't have that in Catholicism. And in a sense, I think it might be a bit much for me. She said, well, meet her anyway. And so we met, and actually, what we realized very, very quickly, apart from all the other things of her being wonderful and beautiful and intelligent, talented, and all of those things, but we both had the same sort of Catholic upbringing, and we kind of recognized it. And it keeps coming back in our life all the time. So we wanted to get married in the same way. We had the same sort of extended family. Siobhan's family, her mother was from Donegal, one of, I think, even more sisters, perhaps sisters and brothers, perhaps 12. So these big extended families, we understood that about each other. Both our sets of parents hadn't particularly gone through education, but we had. And then, it goes forward in life. Even when our kids, we've got a son and a daughter who are now 28 and 25. But when it came to them going to school, in our bit of London, we went round and we looked at the local state primary school and looked at things, and then we went up the road, because this bit of London that I live in Kilburn, which used to be called County Kilburn, which was where all the Irish immigrants came in the first place, still had, less so now, we're talking 30 years ago, had a very strong Irish community. So there was a convent primary school, so we went up, and it had one of the few nuns still leading a primary school, Sister Francine, that's what she was called. And we walked around, and it was full of statues of Our Lady, and in a sense we both thought of ourselves as quite modern Catholics. And I remember just looking at each other and saying, yeah, this is the right place, isn't it? So in a sense, all those difficulties parents sometimes have about how they want to bring up their children, all of those things, I just think we kind of understand each other obviously in all sorts of ways, but on a very deep level around that. And I think that's really, really important. And we can, even now, our kids are grown up now, we can do... Our friends, our not Catholic friends, find it very odd. So just before lockdown, one of the things I followed when I was at Catholic Papers was the whole evolving situation in Latin America. And Oscar Romero, of course, died in 1980, which was before I knew anything about him. The Archbishop of San Salvador was murdered at his altar. But I'd always been interested in him. And a group of people who had known him, based here, do this pilgrimage once a year to El Salvador, where you go. And so I said to Siobhan, I'd really like to go. And she said, well, what will happen? I said, well, we'll go to where the Archbishop was shot, and we'll go to various other massacre sites, and we'll meet people who had terrible experiences. And we're staying in a Jesuit retreat centre, so it probably won't be very comfortable, and there'll probably be lots of priests there. And she said, great, I really want to do that. And I couldn't have married anybody else who would have wanted to do that. And we loved it. And it was a bit like my childhood, going on the parish pilgrimage down the road. And so we live in London most of the time, but we have this kind of house in the country, it's very small. Actually, it's an old Methodist chapel, oddly, so I am ecumenical. But it's just down the road from Walsingham, which is Britain's oldest Marian shrine. So we're virtually on it's been a continual pilgrimage. We're always doing these things. So that's what bonds us. So the Catholic bit is absolutely there.
All right,
and
Peter,
it matters somehow.
Peter Stanford's talking now about his family, and I want you guys who are listening and watching this program to get his books, because they're wonderful. One of the books of yours that I have a fondness for is kind of a biography of Martin Luther. And in the seminary, we put on John Osborne's play, Martin Luther, and I got to play the role. So a church historian, Monsignor Glim, gave us a class on what was going on during the Reformation, and he said, looking at the room of actors, which one of you is playing Martin Luther? And I said, I am. And he said, you look nothing like him, and you should thank God for that. But I love your writing and stuff. But I want to get back to Francis one more time before we bring this to a wrap. Unlike any other pope that I can think of, maybe the first pope ever, he does interviews, and he'll sit down with journalists and he'll answer all sorts of questions. And in my experience, when I was a younger priest, was that you got the Pope's books, whether it was Benedict or John Paul, but they were clearly packaged, and there were only so many places you could go with them. With Francis, you don't know when he answers a question where he's going to go, and sometimes that can be broadly misinterpreted by people. Do you like, and I'm going to presume you do as a journalist, do you like the access that Francis gives to his thought?
I think it's great, and I think it serves a wider community. So I think the Pope has a position of leadership in the world,
Yes.
not just in the Catholic world. I mean, there are how many of us? What is it? 1.2 billion. So there's plenty of us to lead as well. But I think we are. Again, without wanting to be controversial, we are slightly lacking in moral leadership at an upper level in some ways, and I like that about him. I don't know if it's come out in the States yet, but he's now done what they say is the first autobiography by a pope called Hope, which I've just been reading and writing about here. And I loved all the stuff. He's sort of done what you and I just did. We talked about our families in a folksy sort of way. But I love the way that he takes things that happened in his life. He talks about his grandfather fighting in the First World War, and then talks about his horror of war, and he talks about his parents emigrating from Italy to
Right.
Argentina, and then he goes on and talks about migrants and the reasons why people migrate and how we should treat migrants. He does all of those things, and he does it with real charm. Actually, I like it. I mean, he does show a flash of steel sometimes, doesn't he? He can get cross occasionally,
Yes, he does.
which I'm almost pleased about, because frankly, we all get a bit cross, don't we? Sometimes. Well, you probably don't. You're sitting smiling, but we all get a little bit cross sometimes. And I think it's good that he seems very human, and I think he feels approachable. And I like a lot of the things that he says about, you can see from what I said beforehand about getting out of the churches. So one of the things I do as well as writing is I run a small prison reform charity where we help young serving and ex-prisoners to go on to university. And prison chaplains, really, really important, the work they do. And that thing of taking things out of churches and getting to people, often when they're at their most vulnerable, and giving them the sort of support. I like that. I like that about him. I feel proud. I feel proud in a funny. Proud's a word you sort of avoid slightly, isn't it now? But I feel proud of being Catholic because of him.
I'm very proud of him too. I love him. I think he's what we need right now, and I have to battle some of my own parishioners on that because they're not always fans. Because he takes stands on things like global warming, climate change. I promise my wrap up question, but I guess I'm wondering to myself as we look to beyond Francis. I remember I was working at Fox News when Francis was elected, and we were absolutely sure that he was too old to be elected. So we had all our preparations done on the other Argentine cardinal who we thought had a better chance of being elected. So we were all sucking wind, as it were, when they said it was Bergoglio. But I mention that to you because I know it's a fool's errand to decide. We may have an insight into who's going to be the next pope, but I'm sure when they name a batch of these cardinals from places that have never had a cardinal before, it makes all of us wonder, where's it going in the future? Peter Stanford, do you have any clue as to where the church is moving in the next conclave?
I'm not the Holy Spirit. I can't tell you what's going to happen in these things. I had the same experiences as you had. I was sitting in the BBC news studio when they were waiting, and they sort of said, "Okay, tell us who you think it is." And I thought it was going to be the one from Sao Paulo. Was he called Hummus or anyway something? And so I was busy writing it, and then they came out very quickly and announced it, and they said, "What name did he say?" And I said, "Didn't quite catch it actually." So I was the expert who didn't really know, and in fairness, it could have been slightly more. We could have imagined it more, but I had the same thing as you. I thought it'd be younger. I mean, I think now we have had popes from. Well, Francis said, didn't he, when he came out on the balcony, they've had to choose a pope from the end of the world. Now we've had popes from the end of the world. I think we could probably live perfectly happily with a pope from another part of the world. Africa seems, I suppose that from a European point of view, I think African church leaders tend, and this is a very sweeping generalization, to be more conservative in their views, and their views are more at odds with the way Western society works, but not always. And of course, what we do need to think in a very earthbound way, so with my journalist hat on, would be that Francis has named quite a large proportion of the cardinals who gather in the conclave. Okay, I'll give you one prediction. I don't know if any of your listeners, I don't know if you have watched Conclave, the film that's out at the moment. Okay, I confidently predict, and I'm not going to give away the ending, but you won't get a pope like the one they get at the end of that. That's my only prediction.
Right. Yeah. And most people from my parish and others who have seen it would say it was, in many ways, a very impressive movie. They didn't think the ending was necessary, but it certainly got them talking and made it interesting. And I'm hoping to have Mr. Harris, who wrote the book, on our program as well. We are running out of time, but Peter, I want to thank you, first of all, for being on our program. And I hope this will be the first of many conversations we have. You are delightful. And even when you forget where you're going, you're still delightful. It was wonderful. I hope our listeners and viewers will go online. And Peter Stanford has written so many wonderful books. And Peter, for folks who want to find out, like, what has he written and where can I find your work? What's the best way for my listeners and watchers to read more about what Peter has written?
I've got a website you can look on there, which is just peterstanford.org. You can find it. You can find a list of them there. There are some biographies. You've talked about Luther. I look at the Catholic side of Luther. I think Luther died thinking he was a Catholic still. And at the moment, I'm writing a biography of Gaudi, the architect from Barcelona. So everyone writes books about how marvelous his architecture is, and whose architecture did he learn from? And he told us constantly, it was God. God. He always said, God is my client. So let's take it at face value and try and explore what that means. So you can find them there. And yes, thank you for that advertisement.
This is wonderful. And Peter, please make sure you show this interview to your wife so she knows how much you adore her.
I did a radio. They have a radio thing here on Radio 3, BBC Radio 3, which is called Private Passions, where you have to choose, I don't know, 6 pieces of music or whatever that mean a lot to you, and they have to be classical music, which I struggled with a bit. So I chose the music we had at our wedding, but when I got back, they record it live. When I got back, she said, "You didn't mention my name, did you?" And I said, "Well, I played the music from our wedding. Surely that's enough." She said, "You mentioned other people. You didn't mention me." So just for avoidance, my wife is called
great Catholic teaching, Peter. Happy wife, happy life. Happy wife. Peter Stanford's been our guest. Thank you so much for being with us on Personally Speaking. Hopefully see you again, Peter, and God bless. Thanks for all the good you do.
Really enjoyed it. Thanks, Monsignor Jim. Take care.
Thanks for being with us on Personally Speaking. If you need to reach me, you can do that at personallyspeakingpodcast@gmail.com. You probably listened to this program on Sirius XM, the Catholic channel 129, but you can also watch the program on YouTube by searching under Personally Speaking with Monsignor Jim Lisante. We're also on Facebook at Personally Speaking with Monsignor Jim Lisante and on Instagram at Personally Speaking Podcast. If you go to Personally Speaking with Monsignor Jim Lisante, you are offered not only this interview, which you can watch, but also Sunday Mass. We'd love to have you as a extended part of the Our Lady of Lourdes family from Massapequa Park, New York. I'm privileged to serve as host and executive producer of Personally Speaking. Our producer is Lisa Janovitz. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll be with you again next time on Personally Speaking.